field. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Miller-Hooks for this great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. This is really great to be here. I've gone to Florida like multiple times a year since I was about 4 years old because my family had lived in southern Florida, but I've never been to Tampa, so this is pretty cool. Or maybe I was at Busch Gardens when I was like 6 or 7, but that's all I remember. So it's beautiful here, and I really like it. It's so fun to be at your university. Thank you. So today I'm going to talk about a body of work that has occurred over about 13 years probably. And I'm going to try to synthesize it in a way, not just go through it, but try to give you a bigger picture from it and something that sort of the takeaways that I'm thinking about now after this body of work has been developed or is is still culminating in different things. So I'm going to try a couple of different things to get across while I do this. I'll see what I mean in a second. So I know that you all know about our infrastructure and about transportation, so I probably won't say very much about this, but in short, our infrastructure systems are the lifelines of society. We build these things for society to have vibrant societies, right, and to support them. In much of the world, these infrastructures are aging, they're operating at their limits, so that means that little things that happen, they push them over the edge and they don't work for us anymore. They're often located in vulnerable areas, like in Florida, for example. And they are increasingly dependent on cyber capabilities, so they're vulnerable to intrusions, disruptions, and failures. And we know that transportation systems in particular are the backbones of our modern society in terms of three different things. One, they provide the mobility for people and goods, but they're also crucial when an event happens, and so in evacuation and recovery. And they also sometimes serve as the weapon, which is a horrible thing to think, but that's, so they sort of play various roles in these kind of emergency situations. So as they are so important to our ability to live in a society, we want to understand how they're going to continue to perform when something happens, when there are disruptions, which are inevitable. So you've heard this word resilience for sure by now. When we started this word was not out there. We didn't know what to call our work. So at the beginning, we started calling this a concept that it had as flexibility. And then later started to call it resilience as we talked to various social scientists. We were like, well, what is this thing? So when we started, what the idea was, we had a project, I had a small project that was looking at transport of cargo between Washington, D.C. and New York and saying, how do we keep this really doing well? And I started thinking about networks. So I work in network optimization most of my career, and I was thinking about all the measures that are out there. And at the time, the only measures were things like connectivity. Will the network stay connected if you lose this component or that component? But they weren't looking at actions you could take on that network in the immediate aftermath of an event that might get you back up and running very quickly. So for example, let's say you have a data, like a communications network, and it has a router. And that router is the single point of failure. Goes down, the whole system's going to be down. You would say it's terrible, terrible system. But let's say you have a backup router sitting in the closet and somebody knows how to put it in and they're always around. They take it, they put it in, you're back up and running. So is that really such a bad design? And there weren't these kind of network approaches where you could account for those adaptations. That adaptation with the inherent coping capacity, when you put those together, that's resilience. So every time we talk about this word resilience, we need to see those two components. You'll see that people use the term resilience for many different things, but it's not always really what we're talking about. So what I'm going to do today is talk about these 7 different applications. I'll spend a little more time on some, a little less time on others, but I want to give you this picture and try to answer and open up some questions about this idea of resilience. I'm going to start with a little more detail at the beginning, even though those models are simpler, just so that you can see sort of what's under the hood and know what I'm talking about. And then later I'll probably just go a little bit faster, and you'll know that, okay, the math gets harder and it gets a little more structured and the structures change, but you'll have a clue what this is all about. So I'm going to start at the beginning. When we first started, we were thinking about that cargo network and the rail and truck system, basically. And then I had a project with the European Union where we got to work with a particular port. And so we tried to take this concept and apply it to the port. So I'm going to start with that. My goal today, or goals I should say, today in this talk, is to talk about the mathematical structure and the implications for solution in terms of quantifying resilience and choosing enhancement strategies for improving resilience of these systems. And I'm going to talk about when do certain mathematical structures work for certain applications, why you need different structures for different applications, and then how, I want to ask these questions about how to interpret resilience. When we started, we had one perspective, but this has grown out in many, many different directions, and we've started asking a lot of different questions. So for example, how do we account for diversity in users, which you'll see a very specific example, or how does the resilience measure change with the application, or whose perspective do we take when we have more than one infrastructure? Those kinds of things I want to bring up today. So I'm going to start with cargo. So when we first started, it was a student and I were thinking about that problem I was telling you, like, okay, so how do you account for those adaptations? And we mathematically modeled it. We had no desire to optimize anything, but we ended up optimizing. We ended up saying, well, let's put this into a framework, a mathematical framework, and then we ended up saying, well, we're really measuring resilience when you take optimal actions post-event. So the model looks something like this. What you have at the top, oops, sorry, hit the wrong button. At the top, we have an objective that's going to be the measure of resilience, and in this case, we're going to compare it to a baseline. The baseline is a constant, so it's not in the model. So basically what you're seeing is, here, this is C, is our scenarios. I'm taking a multi-hazard approach in everything we see. So that means we're hedging against disruptions that might occur. We don't know which disruption is going to occur. There's a probability of different things happening. And under each scenario, the system's going to perform differently. It's going to be impacted differently. And I need to know what is my throughput going to be when that happens. I have an original demand. I'm thinking about cargo now. I have an original demand. My new flows under any scenario should not be greater than that demand. I have capacity constraints that if I take certain repair actions or recovery actions, I'll improve my ability, my capacity later. So the actions I take with this little bit of money and a little bit of time will give me some added, some of the adaptation strategies you use will give you a little bit more back to your network. I have a budget that's small for taking actions. We'll see this in examples in a second. And then I have the implementations. So there's a time it takes to implement certain strategies, and if they take too long, your flows won't get through early enough, so your level of service won't be met, and then you wouldn't count it towards your resilience. So the idea is we count the throughput as getting through if we meet a target under different scenarios. Some scenarios, it would be acceptable. Let's say originally your cargo was supposed to be delivered in 2 weeks. Under certain scenarios, they might accept 3 weeks or 4 weeks. Under other scenarios, maybe even 5 weeks or just a couple days more. So there's an acceptable level of service that you would have under just different disruptions. And if you meet that acceptable performance, you'd say the system is, you count that in the system's performance. So that particular formulation was where we started. And that particular formulation only has resilience enhancement actions that you can take post-event, once you realize what the event was. And as a result, we can decompose this problem into a set of deterministic problems. So it was stochastic, now it's deterministic problems, but we proved that each of those deterministic problems, NP-hard, for those of you familiar with it, just means it belongs to a class of problems that are very difficult to solve, and we probably can't solve them exactly efficiently. As the problems get larger, they get harder to solve. And so we developed a technique for solving that I won't go into. We applied it to the port of Swinesha, as well as some other things. These are pictures that my student took while we were visiting Poland. You see the Ro-Ro operations, and you see the gantry cranes here. So the port serves the Nordic countries by ferry, and some of the rest of Europe by cargo ship, and then the hinterlands by rail or road. We modeled all the operations of the port. And I think what's really neat here in modeling the operations is not everything was physical. So for example, a gantry crane was modeled as an arc because when it's picking up the container and moving it, it takes some time. So we come to that like a travel time almost. We had 5 different classes of scenarios, 3 of them terrorism related. And each of these have different characteristics. They were trying to maybe attack the access to the hinterland, or there was a chemical facility on site, so there might be a attack specifically at that chemical facility, that sort of thing. We looked at earthquake and local flooding, and we developed techniques for generating scenarios that would have those properties. We have then ran experiments, and we said, okay, so suppose you have over 1,200 different possible recovery actions you could take. We enumerated all of them, and about $80 million worth of actions you would take. But I give myself a recovery budget of between 0 and 100. If you're going to spend a lot in your recovery phase, it shouldn't count as resilient, right? So it should be something very small that you can do. And we ran experiments to see, well, how many scenarios do we have to use to have stability in the solution? And we found about 5,000 scenarios were required. So we generated 10,000 random realizations from those 5 classes. And we ran this. The Porta-Sunuccia runs at lower than its capacity in general, so it has some buffer. And we found that with 0 budget, we would get about 77% of the throughput we would get before any events on average over all the different disruption scenarios, which is a little bit of money. We could bring the performance up very high. We could see different things, like different stevedoring companies had different performances. One thing we saw really early on that we didn't really think about that was really cool to see was that you sometimes have an incident, a disruption in some location. You don't put your money back in it, you put it somewhere else, because that's going to give you better performance in your system. And I liken this to transit systems, where we develop our transit systems one line at a time, we build on it, but it's not really the optimal thing. If you were to redo it, you'd probably do it a little differently. Same thing happens here. So this, early in our work, we came up with this concept of point resilience. These are 10,000 dots on each of these lines. And so this is showing you that when we have 0 budget, you can't take any action. That's sort of like robustness. So not resilience, there's no adaptation that's happening. You have scenarios with 0 throughput in them. You could pull out those scenarios, identify them, and say, okay, for this particular scenario, it's very, very bad for this port. And what you see is that as you have some budget, the worst case changes quite a bit. So when we have $100,000, we have 60% of our throughput in the worst case. So that's a really big difference, and this is a pretty powerful thing to see. So in this talk, I want to show you how, as I looked at these different applications, how the structure of the mathematical model changes. And I have little icons I made for these things. So here, for each scenario, we've decomposed it. We pick the optimal recovery actions, and we get some kind of performance, and then we take an average over those. So I'm calling this a 1-stage program. It's actually kind of like a 2-stage stochastic program, for those of you who are familiar with that, with no first-stage decision variables. So very unusual way to look at it, but that's how we kind of think of it. So I'm going to move into an airport application. I heard that somebody here is in pavements. I'm going to show you some work that has to do with pavements. So when we started thinking that you could take these recovery actions post-event, started thinking, well, you could also optimize some actions you can take ahead of time to prepare for the things you might do later. So contraflow in transportation is an example where if you want to have contraflow, you're going to have to put certain things in place to have that happen. Otherwise, you can't pull it off at the time. I was thinking of things like you have a fire extinguisher in your kitchen, fire happens, cheap to put it out, quickly to put it out. You can put it out really quickly. If you didn't buy the fire extinguisher, you can't do that. You're going to have a much bigger problem, right? So we built in, so you see the same formulation, except for whatever's in a square. Those are the additions. So now I have two stages. Decisions I make before I know what the realizations are, that's my first stage. And then the response, the recourse actions you take once you know what the hazard is, it's rolled out, it's been realized, you take the optimal thing. So we have some decisions we take for preparedness before we know what's going to happen. Those have some cost for doing it, so we could start balancing, well, should we put our money in the beginning, or should we in preparedness, or should we put our money in reacting to what happens once it happens? Don't prepare for it, don't worry. The country does a lot of that, right? And we can see the benefits of where you put that money. The budget for taking recovery actions will maybe lower. I mean, the cost of taking recovery actions may be lower if you took an action in preparedness, like bought a fire extinguisher. Using it will be cheaper than if you didn't buy one, right? that sort of thing. And likewise, the implementation time might be shorter. I can take an action much faster if I put something in place to be able to take that action. And then I have capacity. It may be that my preparedness action is really capacity enhancing, and then I might have more capacity in my system, giving it more, just more buffer. Now I can't decompose the problem anymore, and we used an integer L-shaped method to solve this. The problem is nonlinear, but the decomposition helps. That formulation looks like this in a real application. So what happens, it kind of blew up, right? So what happened here is we wanted to apply this concept to LaGuardia Airport. And so LaGuardia Airport could have flooding, and this is right before they did have flooding, so we had that in our scenarios. Flooding and earthquake and all those kind of things. Actually, we were looking at 3 different types of incidents. Malicious, so it was attacked. It could be some kind of operational thing, like an aircraft that's very large could land on a runway that's not suited for such a large aircraft, which now with these mega planes that just came out, there's a lot of runways that can't handle it. They have emergency landing, they have to land, they gouge the runway, for example. We had to account for all kinds of operations here that were not in that formulation I showed you before. So the first formulation is more conceptual. This is now integrating the actual operations of the airport. Visibility, for example, which I had a problem with when landing in Gainesville, coming to Florida a couple days ago. We had a problem landing because we had to actually change the direction we were using the runways because they couldn't see how to land. So that plays a major role in the operations of the airport. So there are different configurations for running the runways. We're also modeling the taxiways. In the taxiways, if 2 aircraft are moving at the same direction, you'll get a different flow rate than if one goes and then the other goes. So you have to account for all these kinds of things. We have small aircraft and large aircraft, and now our resilience is a measure of numbers of aircraft, small and large, that could take off and land. A couple other things. This little picture here is just showing you if you had damage to 2 parts of the runway and you fixed one of them, you could get some of the small aircraft off. Now, that's used in military operations, not really in civilian operations. So we have this formulation, we can put it in some kind of decision support system, and we can develop solutions. And so we tried this. We said, we want to know what repair equipment to have at the ready, how many teams we should have ready to know how to use the equipment, what types of damage were possible under the different scenarios. I had a co-author who is a pavements person, so we got really into these details. And we looked at 3 different classes of scenarios: extreme climatic, geologic events, operational, and intentional. And you can see different types of things that could happen depending on the event that happened, but also on the weather at the time that it happens. And likewise, we had different pieces of equipment that could be used to fix these things, and the weather played a big role in it. So you see that there are weather-dependent multipliers that say, like, if I need to fix something that's very, very hot, I might not be able to take that action, or it may take longer for it to cure, or something like this. We developed resilience indifference curves from this. So this is saying your resilience value is a function of the budget that you're allowing and the time of, that level of service, that time that you say is acceptable. When we look at this application, we're looking at on the order of hours, not weeks, because people are now involved. So you'd see, like, if I have a lot of budget, but I have no time to take any action, and that's what's acceptable for the performance, I'm going to have lower resilience values than if, and likewise, if I have a lot of time but no budget for doing anything, I'm going to have lower resilience values, but I'll have higher resilience values if I have these different combinations. And this allows you to sort of look at the trade-offs between these things. Results were able to tell us optimal budget allocation across internal and external actions. We could turn variables on and off and say, okay, no external actions are allowed. How well do we do? No internal resources are available. How well do we do? That sort of thing. We could look at which runway configurations had the highest probability of being needed in different scenarios. And then we moved on to another concept and applied it again to this airport. So what I'm showing you at that time, we've done more than just what I'm showing you. We did a lot of different things, but I realized that all of us were thinking about resilience in the context of pristine conditions. Everything's pristine. No one's talking about it, but they're assuming everything's perfect. So the typical curve you'll see is we're going along, the performance is going along, everything's perfect. Something happens, Like performance drops and it slowly comes back up. You see a typical curve like that. Adaptive capacity is right there until I can come back up to that point. Actually, every component of our system is worn out in some way. Nothing's perfect. Even the day it goes in, it's not perfect. And it's deteriorating. Its performance is deteriorating over time. But we're also taking some maintenance actions, repair actions. And so the performance is going to go up and down. And the different components are going to be in different states. And so now if we want to account for this, we're suggesting that at a certain state, at a certain point in time, everything's in a certain state, the performance is going to depend on the state at that moment. So, and the loss, the degradation in performance could be greater if you're in a poor state. So if you already have some cracking or something like this in your pavement, and now you have flooding, you're more likely to really, that roadway surface is more likely to be more damaged than if it was in pristine condition. And so we started trying to account for that. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but we looked at it from a payments perspective and integrated the serviceability concept with that, and also looked at different maintenance thresholds and applied them to the taxiways and runways. What I think is interesting here is that this means now I have resilience values that are changing with time. They depend on the state of the system. And they generally run between bounds that also depend on the scenarios, which are not deterministic. So, so you see this kind of range of resilience. So we really shouldn't be talking about a single resilience value at all. So this general approach of having the preparedness and mitigation together with the response gives you a two-stage stochastic program. And the solution is hedging against potential future hazard events. And what I want to show you here is that your decisions that you take in the first stage have to be common for every hazard because you don't know what the hazard is going to be yet. And then you take response actions given that you have these preparedness actions already taken. And so you end up with this little icon for a two-stage stochastic program. So everything I've talked about so far has either been cargo or whole aircraft, but we weren't really thinking about the people. What do you think is different when we bring people in? Why would I start worrying about people? Any ideas?
Error, like human error?
Error, okay. What else?
Perishability.
Okay, they're perishable. They need water. We need water, right? So we're sitting in the system. I could leave cargo out. If you notice, like I said, how much cargo gets through in like 4 weeks? If that was a person, they would be dead. So we can't leave a train on the side of the rail that has people in it the same way we could leave cargo. So that's the biggest thing. What else do people do that cargo don't do?
Evacuate.
They do things. They make decisions. They're empowered, right? Our cargo's not empowered. So whether it's evacuating or anything, we might not listen to the instructions we're given. We might evacuate when they tell us to stay in place, for example. So now when I bring that into my models have to look different. So what's happening? So here, we're going to use a bi-level structure, where at the top level, we're going to have in this particular case, we'll have a 3-stage stochastic program. And at the lower level, we're going to have the response of the people. So they're going to be in what we're calling a partial user equilibrium. So it's very often in these network design problems, you have decisions about capacity enhancement or where you're going to add a link or something like this. And then you have, in the top level, and then in the lower level, you have people who are doing things, and a user equilibrium is typical. We use a partial user equilibrium, which is a slightly newer idea that just says that only those users who are on the paths that are affected are going to change paths. So this is kind of an extension of that. So we're looking at what we're calling the settlement stage. It's like immediate confusion stage, and then there's like this period where you're like things are settling down, and then later you're looking at stability. So we use that partial user equilibrium. In our top level, in the upper level, we have 3 stages, and here what we wanted to do was separate mitigation and preparedness. So we said mitigation is kind of things where you're changing the structure of the topology, you're enhancing capacity, you're hardening something so it can't be damaged. Preparedness, so it has some kind of value, intrinsic value that maybe even helps the network in general when nothing happens. Preparedness are actions that you take that have no value unless something happens. So putting the Contraflow pieces into place and pre-staging things has no value unless something happens. And then we have the response phase. Here we said, don't know anything about the disaster. There's many different things that can happen. Here we say, oh, it's a hurricane. It's like 72 hours ahead. I have some idea where it's going to land, but I don't know exactly where it's going to land. I don't know exact damage that's going to happen. here everything's been realized. So we put this in a 3-stage program. Actually, I don't know why I put so much animation in here. I should have done that. I was going a little crazy on the animation for a while. But the idea is I take my actions in the first stage, then I'm going to take different actions in the second stage, depending on the different realization that's occurring as information is rolling out. So as information rolls out, I'm doing different things depending on what I did in the prior stages. And ultimately, I'm going to evaluate the performance of these things based on the lower level response to them. It's called a Stackelberg equilibrium when you look at the solution, where it's best for, it's your best design, given what people will do with that design. It's not necessarily the best for the people. So you have a 3-stage stochastic program, things like that, and now I embed it in this bi-level structure of actions taken in the upper level, and then I have the lower level response. The flows go back, and they are feeding each other different information. So those are just pieces of the formulation. This was much more complicated to solve, so every time we do something, we make things more complicated, it seems. So we had a lot of things to do here, I won't go into all of this, but we had bilinear terms and trilinear terms, which is when decision variables are being multiplied. We had a non-separable travel time function. The other big thing we have is that we take that lower level, we showed that the Tucker conditions that are proven for the user equilibrium formulation that we were building on could be extended for the partial user equilibrium, and then we can replace the whole thing by a single level problem. So we have a single level stochastic impact, mathematical problem with equilibrium constraints. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So about the partial user equilibrium, so what do you mean really exactly? So you said so only those affected on route.
So only if a link on your route has been damaged or hurt in some way would you change your route. Everybody else who's on a route that was unimpacted would stay on it.
So you start with the deterministic user equilibrium status, and then after disruption, then only affected route they can
change their routes to get
do
them
they
equilibrium.
necessarily change their route?
No, not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
So there is some uncertainty involved with the user equilibrium.
No, not uncertainty. It's just a matter of whether or not the other routes, how they're performing, what the options are. So
for those who are affected, how do they make decisions? Is it based on the shortest path, or?
So it's based on their utility functions.
Okay.
So we did not make up this idea of partial user equilibrium, but it's a very new concept. We took it from the literature and just felt like it made sense to use it here.
Okay.
Because I can imagine if I'm not on the route and something happens, why would I change my path? That doesn't make sense, right? It actually doesn't matter. You could use a user equilibrium mathematically and it's the same thing.
Thank you.
So we used a progressive hedging algorithm to solve this. Just the idea, I just want to share with you one thought about this. So in the L-shaped method, you have decomposition by stage, first stage and second stage. In a progressive hedging algorithm, you're going to decompose it by scenario, but remember those betas have to be the same for every scenario, those first stage decisions. So what this algorithm does is it tries to force those betas to be the same. You solve them separately and then you push them toward each other until they're all the same. So, so now you've seen the cargo examples or the airport example. You've seen now we bring people into it. We had a whole bunch of things that we were doing during those years, and we never thought about transportation as part of a system of systems. We just didn't think about it. And really nobody was thinking about it. There was very, very little about this in the literature. So we wanted to try to couple it with another system. So we coupled it with power, coupled the traffic problem with power. So here in power, we're interested in the distribution system. That's this part where we have substations. They provide power to end users. End users for us were the traffic signals. We looked at a little section of Minneapolis only because this is our roadway network that we pulled out. They shared their feeder networks online, which is very, very hard to find. So we could see where all the substations were and all the feeder lines. And then we could superimpose them on this network. So now we have, we use a bi-level problem again, where there's traffic at the bottom. We're taking actions at the top. We just did a two-stage stochastic program for the top level. I have pre-event decisions I'm going to take, like pre-stationing a generator or something like this. I have post-event action, or like maybe even putting solar panels on my traffic signals. Or secondary actions I can take that either have to do with the power system or with the traffic system. Could be something like putting a police officer at an intersection, or moving a generator into place to replace a substation that's gone down.
You might be interested that after Hurricane Irma, when all the traffic signals went dark in Hillsborough County, the county is now adding solar panels, or planning to add solar panels to all their signals, so them.
That's cool, because we just made that idea up.
Yeah, well, it's a real one, and the city of Tampa is working on that too.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so we actually said how much money should go to those things, and should you do that, or should you just deal with the police, and you're going to have traffic delays and that sort of thing. So we have this two-stage stochastic program embedded with, again, just a user equilibrium at the lower level, and we have this bi-level problem. We reduce it again to a stochastic MPEC. I won't go into the details, but what's interesting here is now we have to say, whose perspective? So we start looking at resilience and we say, okay, we're using travel delay as part of our measure of resilience, but whose perspective do we take, and where is the money coming from, and where is it going, and is it better to invest in one system or the other system? So we took a transportation perspective. We said travel delay, we want to reduce travel delay. We're not asking about the end users of the power system. But the power system plays a role in that. And we said, okay, here, put all your money in power and see how well that does. Or restrict all your money to go into transportation and nothing into power, or let it go into both. And I think what's interesting is if you take any of these points, you can look at what is the average unmet power demand at the same time. So that's a secondary thing from our perspective, is to help the power company meet their objectives. But ultimately, the thing that's keeping them coupled together is that repair. Is that if there's a down roadway, it's maybe blocked by trees or flooding or something like this, then you can't take repair actions on the power system. And then if you can't take repair actions on the power system, you can't get power back to your traffic signals. And if the traffic signals are down, you're going to have delays that are going to make the repair crews take longer to get there. So that's that interdependence. But it turns out that if we change just a little bit how we're allocating our funding or allowing our money to be allocated for those repairs, and we're coordinating these things, we can get a lot better average performance in terms of meeting the power demand. I don't know why it's shaking. Meeting the power demand, we can go from a 50% unmet power demand to 12.5% unmet power demand. Isn't that odd that it's shaking? Was it shaking before?
They're doing some work on the ceiling.
Oh, okay.
The roof is being repaired.
Okay, so that was some of the things that came up with
We're
coupling.
trying to make the building more resilient.
We
We timed it with your visit.
So we did something else with coupling that we're wrapping up right now that doesn't use the same structure mathematically. I sort of wanted to abandon that as we move forward. But I just want to talk about this for a moment. I think it's really cool. So we were thinking about a transit system, and that the transit system has different kinds of users. And so you can think that some populations are going to fare better than other populations when a certain disruption happens. So for example, somebody who's mobility impaired has to have the elevators in place, or they may not be able to get up and down the metro, to the metro, for example. Another group might be, I think I have smartphone users, like these are savvy, maybe young people who are really good at ride hailing and have these other adaptations that they can have. So we each, when we go into that system, bring our adaptability to it. We also bring other things to it. So for example, if I miss a day of work because the metro is down and I can't get there, and let's say I don't have a car as a backup, nothing happens to my pay, I'm still going to eat. But other people, they might be in a situation where they don't get to work, they don't get paid, and they don't eat. And so that's really different. That means we have different sensitivity to the things that are happening in that system. But we also bring different adaptations to that system. So when we do this, it means that we need to think about the resilience of how the system's performing for different users. So we actually have diverse users of these systems. It's not just a technical system, it's a socio-technical system. And where do I bring those people in? I can't separate them. I can't just look at A or just look at B, because they interact. If something happens and in a disruption and these people need to run to the transit system, well, the transit system's going to get crowded. So it turns out that when you bring these people in, their adaptations that they bring in couple us with the communications network. So if you think about that, like, okay, some of these users, their adaptations are to use ride hailing. or we all want to go look at the web and see what they're telling us to do because I can't understand the thing that they're saying on the microphones. So, so we then like crowd onto that. So that communication system staying up is really important for the adaptation piece of this. So the looking at it from a socio-technical perspective induces the interdependencies with other systems. They weren't something we were looking at before. We developed an approach that we extend from fault tree approaches that are for reliability, where they're all like on-off. If this service will be provided yes or no, and it's yes or no based on ands and ors, these gates. We've extended that to have multi-valued logic gates here. These look like little tables, and then to ask about service levels as opposed to being in a certain state as opposed to being only on or only off. We ran a case. I know I'm going to run out of time, so I just want to just mention a couple things here. The population's base might be different. So on a typical day, you might have some disruptions anyway, so it's not a perfect system. And their baseline may be different. Should we measure resilience in terms of, say something is resilient or not if it meets a certain threshold? Or should it be in a comparison to how they normally do if they're normally not doing so well? What about comparing it to that base, which the base has some disruption? Should we be comparing distribution functions instead of thinking about, how do we judge if this thing is resilient if there's some issues with not knowing how to perform this on a regular basis anyway? So this application created all kinds of new questions that we really weren't asking. And I show the structure. You're seeing our extension of the binary decision diagrams to multi-value decision diagrams and so on. It's a different structure than I was looking at, but I just wanted to share that application because I think it's really important. It opens all these new questions. So we have this ongoing project now with NSF where at the top level, should have made a bigger picture here. I have a bunch of buildings and they're functioning and connected. They have a common service. So in our case, we're looking at healthcare and their hospitals and clinics. Could be education, the judicial system, anything that your built infrastructure is trying to serve as a service to society. And they depend, the performance of these buildings and all the services that can be provided from those buildings depend on the interdependent lifelines of natural gas and power and transportation and communications and all those things. And so these are interdependent. They're feeding up to that system, and we're asking the question, not how resilient is this, but how resilient is that service given its dependence on interdependent systems. So we are mathematically modeling that as well. I don't want to get into all the details of this. We looked at what we call WET, which is the water, electric, and transportation, trilogy, and looking at this at the top level, the healthcare system. Now our performance is a function of people's lives and are they going to stay alive in some kind of mass catastrophe incident or something like this. And we have sophisticated models for the hospital system that we made into meta models that we then embedded within the mathematical model. We again use a 3-stage stochastic program, but we have something a little bit different here. Our first stage are decisions we take before any kind of event. Our second stage is post-event. So now that the event has happened, I know what's happening in my hospitals, I know what's happened to my lifelines, and there's some information that's revealed, but there's still things that may change from one day to the next. So for example, hospitals have generators. The generators may or may not activate. They have fuel, and the fuel may dissipate, say, in a day or two. If you can't get fuel out to that hospital, you're not going to be able to run in this third stage. Yeah?
Actually, something very similar and tragic happened during Irma as well. Because the power outage and the generator company wasn't bringing generators, some old homes, folks actually just stifled to death there.
Yeah, we saw all that. It was horrible.
So very similar.
Yeah, so there's this time element we wanted to capture. And so even if they had generators in those nursing homes for like the first day, by day 2, day 3, if they couldn't get that fuel out to them, then they wouldn't be able to sustain that, right? In a hospital, that means your blood supplies are going, they're perishing, things like that. So this is really important. And we looked at all kinds of things in here that I won't get into, but I just wanted to show you this particular one. What I think is important in thinking about how do we do that? How do we model all that together, all those different systems together, and ultimately it comes down to the state variables. The state of one system is dependent on the state of another, and so that's how you tie those systems together. This is what the model looks like, and we have a 3-stage stochastic program. We applied it for Johns Hopkins system, part of our team works in it. The only thing I want to say here about this is that their adaptive actions in healthcare have to do with modified operations. You can change your operations, so instead of having doctors do things, you have nurses do things like that. You can change what the paths that the patients take based on their emergency situation and how many casualties you have that need certain things. You might, instead of sending them a place you would ordinarily send them, you send them on a different trajectory through the hospital. Those kind of things can be taken into account, and we modeled all that in these very sophisticated simulation runs. But what's interesting is you can do that, and you can have alternative standards of care, which means you don't spend as much time with each patient. Not every patient gets seen. You get lower service, but you're trying to get more people through in this emergency situation. A governor declares a state of emergency, all of a sudden you're allowed to take alternative standards of care. So we use those as the adaptations. And the thing is that if you take those adaptations, you might have better performance of the system than you did originally. You get lower waiting times and things like that. So you think, oh, well, what's going on here? Resilience is greater than 1. We never had that before. So that opens some questions for us about how do you measure, how do you deal with the fact that the adaptations you're taking are making your system better than it was before. It's not really better, your services are not as good, but it's better in terms of the objective that you're using. The last thing I wanted to describe for you in like 2 minutes, really big different idea, is what happens when you're working in a competition. So here, I was going back to that port idea, and I thought, wow, so you have a port that we're trying to make resilience, but if that port is part of a larger worldwide system, and the other ports are not doing the same thing, and the cargo is going through some whole path, you could do anything you want, you're still going to be affected by some kind of event, and you have no control of it. So what about investing not in just yourself, but invest in some other port? So damage happens here, some kind of disruption, maybe it's a hurricane, it percolates backward to other ports, and then they have delays and so forth that go back and so on. And you can think of that in the air system, that's very common as well. So the characteristics here are that we have multiple decision makers or different port stakeholders. We have decisions taking at one location will affect the performance at other locations. We have competition between these ports. These ports are actually competing. They're not just like working together and happily and harmoniously going along. They want each other's business. They want for you to have a hurricane and give them their demand, and then maybe in the long run you'll even capture that demand. What else do I want to say? You have potential gains from collective action, this cooperation, and what else? But you're also working as competition. So competition plus cooperation, we're calling it a co-opetition. So in a co-opetition, we didn't make up that word, but we found it and we were like, oh, that's it. That's so cool. So we're going to formulate this very differently. So we have the formulation for a single port first. We're going to use, again, a bi-level program where we're maximizing the port throughput at the upper level, and you're making decisions about investments, whether it's in your port or other ports. And then at the lower level, you have this line of shipping problem. So instead of having a user equilibrium, we have a common market that they're all going to share. So that's telling you what routes are going to be used by the different ships. We have a bunch of math. And so we have this bi-level program for a single port. We can reduce, again, this to a single level problem with showing that the KQT conditions are necessary and sufficient, as long as we keep that low level problem, which we took from the literature, as a linear program, we can do that. In extensions of this, we try really hard not to mess with that problem to keep it linear, so that we can continue to do this. So we end up with a single level MPEC. Now we're working on a stochastic MPEC version of this, but right at the beginning, this is what we did. And the solution is obtained at a Stackelberg equilibrium, again, where you're doing the best you can do at the upper level, given the response at the lower level. Okay, so this is just showing you what's at each of those levels, and like what happens when you replace it with the KKT conditions. It's a little fancier. So now I have an MPEC for one port, and I actually have many ports. So they're tied together. Each port has an MPEC, but they have a common lower level KKT conditions. They have a common liner shipping problem they have to share. This is called an EPEC, or an equilibrium problem with equilibrium constraints, very hard to solve. At an equilibrium solution, you're going to say, this is how we're interpreting it, is no port can unilaterally change its investment strategy and improve its throughput or expected throughput if we're looking at the stochastic version. A couple things we looked at that I think are kind of cool to think about. First is, what if you have no investment? This reduces to that lower level liner shipping problem. What if everyone only invests in their own port? So we call that a restricted game. What if everyone invests in everywhere, anywhere they want? A restricted game. What if some are selfish and only want to invest in themselves, and others are willing to put it out there? It's probably more reality. And the last one just is, gives you a balance, the system perspective. So from the system perspective, everybody puts their money in one pot, and then you have to ask, okay, what's the best? And we said, so you have a single centralized budget. I don't want to go into these results. I don't think they're that important. Right now, we've done them one scenario at a time because we kept it deterministic. We're right now working on a stochastic extension of this. So, but this opens some questions. Whose resilience? Is it the system's resilience? In which case, it would be total OD demand served. Is it the port's perspective, which would be profit? So some ports will gain while others lose. And then you want more transshipments because they want more activity. They get paid for transshipments even though they're not very useful for the end user. What about the shippers? They want to minimize cost. I asked questions like, what if you could do better than without the disruption due to a change in market share? Because now some ports have captured some of the market share. And what if you gain from the misfortunes of others? So I just want to recap all of that stuff I just said very quickly. Mathematical structure depends on the application. You can't say there's one structure for any application. I've had so many people come to me and say, I'm working on my PhD on an index for resilience. An index for resilience. It doesn't make any sense to me because the index depends on the application. You just care about continued performance of that performance kind of concept that you care about for that system. So one doesn't fit all. And there's implications for solution, very big implications. When we started, you saw an example with 10,000 scenarios. By the end, this last one that we're making a stochastic version of, we can do 2 to 3 scenarios. So you're looking at something a little different. You're looking at resilience to specific scenarios or to a batch of scenarios as opposed to resilience in general where I take thousands of these things and throw it at it so that it's very stable. How do I interpret it? Performance measured by application, whose perspective in competitive environments, the technical system versus the system user, whose perspective do we take? If the transit example, if we only looked at the technical system, we never would have brought in the adaptations of the people and looked at their different ways of using it, the diverse user experiences, and what happens when you have multiple infrastructures, how do you decide which one to take? What happens when resilience exceeds one? And then I'm just showing you, recapping sort of the structure and the type of solution approach that we look at and the measures that we would use. And you see that they're changing for these different things. The things I didn't mention that are sort of bigger things that we did, my last slide here just to mention, we looked at sea level rise and investments, and what I think is interesting here is that you have a very long time frame for making these large investments for sea level rise. But you have performance of the system on a daily basis. Are there delays on my links in the rush hour caused by flooding? So you have this multi-temporal kind of problem. So we worked quite a bit on that area. We also took something like 20 some odd different topological structures and asked which structures are more resilient than others, just to see if the topology had any effect on it. And we looked at resilience in terms of throughput, OD connectivity, and average reciprocal distance. Again, you can use different kinds of measures. And then we also looked at scheduling those repair actions. Like if you optimally take one action before another action, even if they're within a certain time frame, could you get more out of your system? So here in this example, we're saying, suppose this train is right here and these are both damaged. If I fix this one first and the train was here, it still has to wait for you to fix this one. But if I fix this one first, then it can move to here. While it's moving, this one's getting fixed. So you get a little bit more out of your system. So there's a different mathematical models that came about. This was with a lot of people over a lot of years. These are the PhD students who have worked on it. My colleague Eyal Levenberg was at the Technion in Israel, moved to DTU. He is the payments guy that I talked about. And one student who's continuing right now and working on it. We've had a lot of publications and more stuff coming out that's not listed here. But if you're interested in any of this, you can see on my website. I try to keep it up more or less updated, and you can see the abstracts and things like that on there. So thank you. Happy to take some questions.
We do have some time for questions.
Okay.
I really like the word co-opetition.
Yeah, me too. I'm going to use it for a lot of things.
Yes, I think in the airlines we can see the air transportation is competing with the rail, but also they cooperate, right, to kind of expand the catchment area. So one thing about that problem, I was wondering from the financial point of view, because I know that in the U.S. the ports or airports are kind of belong to the state or county or city, and they run it with authority. So I was wondering how likely you could invest externally.
Yeah.
Is there something different in the port?
So it's interesting. So I was thinking more across countries than across the nation.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been talking with the Port of Singapore. So Singapore is right now in the process of building a new port. They're moving it out of their main city. And they're very interested in ports in other places where the goods that are coming through their port are moving on to these other ports. In fact, some countries own interest in other people's ports. I think China probably owns good sections of different ports. So they do have those kinds of relationships and are thinking about these things. So if you think about, for Singapore, they are in, forget the name of it, the straits that are right there. They have piracy there. It's very, very important for them that if they can't maintain reliability of that portion of the world's cargo movements, they're going to lose it, especially with the the whole Arctic new routes. So so it is something for them to start thinking about. And so I was talking with them about this, and they're interested in it. Well, will they do it? I don't know. But if you take something like China or different companies that are starting to run these things, I've heard that there are things like Walmart that will have their own intermodal facilities, their own like almost like joining their warehouses with intermodal facilities, and so they're going to start owning them around the world, and so then they would maybe start thinking that way. But these strategic partnerships, I think, are really important. So in some new work we're doing right now, I'm not showing you here, is about collaboration between ports. What are the collaboration strategies? What would they mean? And I talked with the Port of Virginia, and they're working with a port in Georgia, that they said they want to be able to share some capacity when something happens, so that they're ready to deal with the land link issues and stuff like that, and common like the carriages or what they need to support the movement on land of the cargo if someone were to come into their port instead of somewhere else because of weather or something like that. So they are starting to think about these partnerships, but nobody's measured what they mean. So how beneficial are they? And so we're looking at different collaboration strategies and trying to understand how that would change the flow of goods and whatnot. And their thinking was that if they can collaborate together on a coast, then that coast is going to look more reliable, and that more goods will want to come through that general area, maybe not the specific port, knowing that they have backup and knowing that it's going to, something happens, they're going to still be taken care of, so that they're more likely for everybody in the collaboration to have a win-win situation. So they are looking at these things. It's just really no one's looked at it in this way. Yeah, thanks. I think there was a question. Yeah. Okay.
So I know you mentioned that people are different from objects because they try to make decisions. And my question is about people having enough information. For example, for sea level rise, if everyone's informed that it will, in the long run, affect us, they will behave differently if nobody knows that something will happen. Versus the actual situation is some people knows and believes, and some people knows and doesn't believe. Some people do not know anything.
So in the sea level rise case, we have 3 trajectories we use for the future. So we look at the uncertainty. We look at the 5th percentile, 50th, and 95th percentile. So you have trajectories that are low, trajectories that are high, and we ask, we developed the mathematical framework to be able to say how would you invest over this long time frame, given that you want to reduce the travel delays in the short time frame, and given that it's not just sea level rise that we're looking at, but also the added precipitation events that go along with the climate change that would happen for that sea level rise to be achieved. So we've done that, and then we did a second paper where we asked, how much does it matter if you hedge against uncertainty? And how much does it matter if how much will it matter if you make the right decision or the wrong decision? If you were to think about only the 5th percentile, so you're like a non-believer, and you take no action whatsoever, what's the cost going to be to you if this other situation occurs? And we look at all these different combinations of things in that paper to show, like, why does it matter to hedge against these things? How valuable is it? How valuable is it to take action before the case rather than just wait until it happens and then take it? And so that sort of thing. So we kind of investigated that. In some sense, we didn't ever say the believers and non-believers, but that's kind of what we were saying. But also, I think the issue is that we really don't know what to expect and when to expect it, and so there is no one universal truth that everyone's going with. I have a friend who works for, I guess it's NOAA, and he's one of the people in charge of those estimates. So I've talked with him about those estimates, and I think they're doing new estimates right now, something like that. Hopefully they're still allowed to. So, any other question?
So about the say proper measure of resiliency.
Yeah.
So in most cases, as far as I see it, you use the expectation as your risk measure of resiliency of something.
Yeah, I know your work on.
Yeah, right. So some people use it like a worst case or risk averse measure.
Yeah.
So
So
I was wondering your view. In which case is more appropriate to use the expectation-based one?
Right.
And,
right. So in general, I don't like the expectation operator. Just because it's something that's valuable for something that happens over and over and over, right? It's a frequency kind of a concept. We've done other work that I didn't show you here that's not for resilience, but it's for very similar emergency applications where we looked at sort of like a robust optimization approach. And it's not clear to me what the right thing to use is, and I think it's really up to a community to decide how risk averse or risk seeking they are. Do they want to plan for one scenario? Do they want to plan for a bunch? My general feeling, though, is that I don't think, these are like planning tools, right? So you need some rough idea, are you okay or are you not going to be okay? And I have this hunch, although I've not shown this, that you can do well by just planning for a few really different things and just hedging against all of them. Then you'll take actions ahead of time that are a little different than if you, even work, like, then of course if you did one or the other, or if you did something that's more skewed. But I have this hunch that it doesn't matter what the scenarios are, and that as long as they're like diverse, you're going to be hedging against different things. And so I'm not sure what the right operator is. We did a building evacuation approach where we looked at 4 different models, and we did like something like I forget what it was, but like minimizing the maximum something or other, things like that as the operators. And you can show that there's different reasons to do these different things. In general, in these kinds of emergency situations, the disruptions that we're thinking about are so severe that if we take a very conservative approach, it's going to be so costly that our society wouldn't do anything. So, so we've sort of struggled with what one should do there. But the other thing you don't notice, because I didn't say it, when we started out, we didn't know if that expectation operator should keep in account of when nothing happens. So we're actually conditioning on that something happens. And if you really take into account that nothing might happen with a high probability, society will never do anything to prepare. But I don't think that's the right thing either. So, but it's an interesting question. Yeah.
For mitigation, prepare for the disaster. I think suppose we have different kind of activities, and how to measure this kind of different kind of activities influence on the performance of the component in the system.
Right.
Yeah. Sometimes we have real field
So we're assuming that we know that. I have thought about the idea that even like places where you think you take an action that's going to have a certain response from the system, and it doesn't have that response. So even if you think you know it, you might not know it. So that was one thing I was thinking about. And then I was thinking about like people who are, like maybe you're in certain parts of the world where maybe you spend money on something and nothing happens. Someone just takes the money and they don't actually do good work that would result in what you would think it should result in. So I thought, wow, we could also take that into account and add some stochasticity into some of the factors within the model itself. We haven't done that, we've thought about it, I just haven't gone there. But in the case of the port of Swanucha, that's the one where we had the most data. And it took a really long time to get all the pieces together, to know how long does it take for a gantry crane to move a container and all those details. So it's tricky to do those things. You'll notice also that everything I did was exact. And so almost everything here was exact. Only the sea level rise we used something that was inexact. So, or there's some linearization going on, but it's more or less exact. My feeling is that for me, I'm not interested in developing heuristics in general, just because anyone can develop them for anything. I wanted to show how do we conceptualize these things, and how do we get benchmarks from them. And then if somebody wants to do heuristics and use that in the field, that might make more sense. But at least you have a clue if your heuristic is useful or not, and a clue of how to think about these things. Because as you see, like every time we added a new feature, it totally changed everything about the problem. So, yeah, but I think that's really insightful. I know that we're breaking into people's lunchtime.
If no other questions, I would like to, before it finishes, I would like to remind this afternoon and 2 p.m. we will have a meeting with faculty, and maybe for CUTR and CE, but not exclusive to faculty from all other departments. And also, after that, 4 o'clock, we're going to have some light reception at the World of Beers. If you will have questions for academic or for this presentation or anything else, welcome to come. With this, let's thank Dr. Miller again.